Claressa Shields and Papoose did not just walk a red carpet on June 28th. They may have walked straight into the one question their entire public storyline cannot afford, because the second Claressa turned and asked, "What is this, year 2 or 3?" At the BET Awards, the room stopped being about fashion, romance, or optics and started being about math. And that is the problem. Not gossip. Math. Because if the relationship story the public has been getting is that the romance began around the Shakur-Stevenson fight window in 2024 and that their actual anniversary is September 23rd, then year 3 is not a cute little flirty slip. Year 3 is a wrecking ball swinging at the clean timeline version of events they have been presenting in interviews. And the reason this matters is bigger than one viral clip. It hits Papoose's entire public identity, because for years his brand was loyalty, steadiness, black love mythology, the husband who stayed down, the guy who turned patience into a personality trait. Once the timeline starts wobbling, that whole brand starts wobbling with it. And when that brand wobbles, the culture has to revisit what it thinks it knows about Remy Ma, about Papoose, and about whether this relationship was really a fresh chapter or just the public launch of something that had already been moving behind the curtains. We are going to get to the exact public statements, the anniversary problem, the July 2024 meeting story, and why this is less about romance than it is about narrative control in the social media era. Because the minute a couple starts telling the public precise dates, precise origin stories, and precise emotional sequencing, the audience becomes an auditor. And when the numbers do not line up, the receipts start talking louder than the people do. This is what everybody keeps missing. The loudest part of the clip is not even Claressa saying year 3. It is how fast Papoose jumps in with 2, the second one, like the answer had to be caught midair before it landed somewhere dangerous. That is why the clip feels so combustible. If he had laughed, paused, thought about it, waved it off, that would be one thing. But the instant correction is what turned a red carpet moment into timeline discourse, because now the internet is not just hearing one number. It is hearing 2 competing instincts in the same 5 seconds. Her mouth threw out a number that sounds older. His mouth snapped it back to the number that sounds cleaner. And once that happens on camera, everything else people said before starts getting reread with a microscope. Now the audience is not just asking when they started dating. The audience is asking whether the public story was carefully stage managed from the beginning, whether the relationship was rolled out in phases, and whether the official version only became official after the social media war between Remy Ma and Papoose made the old image impossible to keep. Listen, I am not here to convict anybody of something I cannot prove. I am here to say that when celebrities turn their love life into a timeline, they lose the luxury of fuzzy arithmetic. That is the tax. The minute you start telling us exact windows, exact anniversaries, exact this is when it became real narratives, we stop being casual viewers and become timeline detectives. And right now, the timeline is doing too much talking. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. To understand why one sentence could hit this hard, you have to remember what the culture attached to Papoose in the first place. He was never just a rapper with bars. He was a symbol. Papoose and Remy Ma spent years being sold and celebrated as one of hip-hop's most durable love stories. The prison years, the loyalty, the reunion, the family, the televised vows, the whole black love package, that was not just their relationship, that was their public equity. So when Remy Ma went public in December 2024 with alleged text messages and accusations involving Claressa Shields, it did not feel like ordinary celebrity mess. It felt like the collapse of a long-standing cultural myth. People reported that Remy shared alleged private messages between Papoose and Claressa and accused Claressa of planting negative stories, while Papoose publicly fired back by calling Remy a narcissist and saying he had requested a divorce numerous times. XXL similarly framed the moment as a social media war over infidelity allegations, with all sides dragging the private mess into public view. That was the first real fracture. From there, the story stopped being about a pristine marriage and became a blame war over who stepped out, who moved on first, and who was trying to rewrite the sequence to look cleaner than it really was. And once a breakup story becomes a sequence story, timing becomes everything. Timing is innocence. Timing is credibility. Timing is reputation. Timing is the difference between new chapter and overlap, between moved on and was already gone. That is why this matters right now. Not because the internet likes drama, even though it absolutely does, but because the entire moral framing of this story sits on when exactly Claressa and Papoose became more than friendly. And Claressa, to her credit, has not been ducking the relationship in public. She has been speaking on it. BET reported that on The Breakfast Club, she said she and Papoose are together all the time, that they talk about kids and family, and that we love each other. Complex summarized that same interview by saying she described meeting him around the Shakur Stevenson fight in July 2024 and framed the public chaos with Remy as happening after they had already been dating for about 3 months. Then on the Tamron Hall show, she and Papoose leaned into the love story packaging even harder, how they met, how the DMs happened, the poems, the first date in New York, and the claim that their actual year is September 23rd. That is what raises the stakes here. This is not a couple that has avoided details. This is a couple that has given the audience details. They gave the crowd a meet cute. They gave the crowd a symbolic anniversary. They gave the crowd a sequence. So when a later red carpet moment throws a bigger number into the air, it does not land like random confusion. It lands like contradiction. And because this is hip-hop adjacent celebrity culture, contradiction does not sit quietly. Contradiction gets clipped, reposted, memed, stitched, slowed down, and turned into 100 commentary videos before breakfast. Does everybody understand how crazy that is? Once the relationship becomes serialized content, one sloppy line can reopen every old accusation. And that is why the stakes are not just romantic. They are cultural and reputational. For Claressa Shields, who is one of the most accomplished boxers of her generation, this kind of narrative fog can swallow athletic achievement if it gets loud enough. For Papoose, it threatens a public image that was built for years on being the stable one. For Remy Ma, it reopens whether the public pinned too much of the marriage implosion on her without fully understanding what the sequence actually was. And for the media ecosystem, it becomes another test of how quickly one viral moment can rewrite a year's worth of coverage. The audience thought it was being given a clean post-marital romance story. The clip suggests that the real problem may be that the dates have never sounded as clean as the packaging. So the question driving this whole video is simple. Did Claressa just casually say the quiet part out loud, or are we watching a public couple lose control of the very timeline they worked so hard to standardize? Let's go straight to the first piece of surface evidence, because this is where the whole thing detonates. At the 2026 BET Awards, a clip circulated in which Claressa asks Papoose, "What is this, year 2 or 3?" And Papoose immediately answers, 2, the second one. That line did not come from a rumor blog inventing chaos. It came from the red carpet clip itself, which was surfaced widely in social posts and search results around the event. Now, on its face, somebody miscounting a public appearance is not a federal case. People forget dates all the time. But context changes everything. If this were a relationship with no public origin story, nobody would care. But this is a relationship that has repeatedly given the audience a public origin story. So the moment she offers year 3 as a plausible option, she is not just fumbling a memory. She is stepping outside the boundaries of the version the audience has already been taught. And the faster Papoose corrects it, the more it feels like that boundary matters. This is exactly how small clips become giant clips. It is not because they prove every allegation ever made. It is because they introduce friction into a story that was supposed to sound settled. The second the numbers stop agreeing, the audience stops trusting the narrator. The second piece of surface evidence is the Breakfast Club timeline, and this is where things get even messier. The transcript pulled from that interview shows Claressa and Papoose saying, "We've been together over a year and a half now, and that it will be 2 years in September." Now, even if you allow for casual conversation, loose wording, or a transcript imperfection, that is still a very specific public framing. It places the romance in a relatively recent window and points towards September as the milestone marker. BET's write-up of the interview reinforces the seriousness of the relationship and notes Claressa saying their connection predates the public fallout with Remy. Complex's coverage of that same discussion ties their meeting to the Shakur Stevenson fight in July 2024 and describes the online blow-up as arriving after they had already been involved for months. So that is the frame the public has been given. Mid-2024 meeting, months of talking, meaningful connection, September anniversary logic. That frame is why the BET Awards clip hits so hard. If you build a relationship on a recent, measurable, interview-friendly timeline, year 3 is not just a bigger number. It is a number from another story. Can we have the real conversation now? Because the clean timeline crew cannot keep throwing out precision in one room and vagueness in another, and then act shocked when the internet starts doing subtraction. The third piece of surface evidence is the Tamron Hall interview, and this one is important because it is even more polished. On that show, Papoose and Claressa describe meeting at that Shaq-Stevenson fight, moving into DMs, texting for a long time, exchanging poems, and going on a first date in New York. Most importantly, the transcript includes Claressa saying, "It'll be our actual year. September 23rd. That is about as gift-wrapped as a public timeline gets. You have a meet-cute, a literary courtship angle, a first-date image, and a specific anniversary date. That is not accidental. That is not messy. That is a packaged romance narrative built for daytime television. And look, there is nothing wrong with presenting your relationship nicely. Celebrities do it all the time. But once you package it that neatly, you have to live inside the package. You do not get to leave the box on Tamron and then freestyle the numbers on a red carpet 2 weeks or months later. That is what makes this so wild. The audience is not asking for private details that were never offered. The audience is comparing public details that were volunteered. So if somebody wants to say, maybe she was just confused, okay, maybe. But confusion is still a problem when you are the one who made the date a public talking point. The more polished the love story, the less room there is for timeline static. The fourth piece of surface evidence is the $1 million worth of game interview because it gives us even more structure. In that conversation, Claressa says the Newark event was July 6, 2024, ties it to the Shakur-Stevenson card, says they were texting for mad long before they saw each other again, and says that for the first 4 to 5 months, they were constantly connected, even falling asleep on the phone. She also describes a first date in New York in the back of Papoose's Sprinter and says the first picture of them together blew up the next day. That is not fog. That is a step-by-step public story. And the more steps a story has, the easier it is to test. July 6, 2024 is a real event. Top Rank and ESPN both place Stevenson versus Artem Hart-Union in Newark on that date, so the meeting point is easy to anchor. The issue is not that the relationship lacks detail. The issue is that it has so much detail that an answer like year 3 sounds like it wandered in from outside the official script. When your own interviews create a neat staircase, one random line can make the whole audience wonder whether there was a landing before the first step you showed them. Now add one more visible piece of evidence that people tried to treat like fluff, but is actually important: the optics around the BET Awards themselves. The Shade Room reported that when Claressa and Papoose arrived, fans fixated on how excited she looked versus how stone-faced he looked, with commenters joking that he was scanning the room for Remy Ma and others saying body language does not lie. Claressa replied in the comments, "Protect your woman at all times." Flat out. That matters, because once a relationship enters the body language stage of internet discourse, every glance becomes evidence and every facial expression becomes a referendum. The Clean Timeline crew is no longer controlling the image. The audience is now reading the image against the timeline, against the interview history, against the prior allegations, against the social media war. That is what happens when a story gets hot enough. Even silence starts talking. And if you think that sounds unfair, welcome to celebrity culture. One person is smiling like the night is a coronation, the other is wearing the face of a man doing airport security, and the crowd is already connecting that to the numbers problem. And oh, do I have more for you? Because this is where the stands are really not going to like it. Up to this point, you could still pretend this is just one awkward clip, one weird answer, one woman accidentally overshooting the count. But the second you lay the BET Awards clip next to The Breakfast Club, Tamron Hall, and $1 million, you do not have one slip anymore. You have a public relationship that keeps describing itself in ways that are close enough to feel coordinated and loose enough to keep triggering questions. And in the next part, I want to show you why the culture reacted so hard, why Remy Ma's December eruption still hangs over all of this, and why this story stopped being about who likes who a long time ago. It is about who gets to define the sequence. And if you are one of the Clean Timeline crew saying, "Y'all are reaching," I hear you. But tell me this, if the story is that tidy, why does every major appearance seem to generate a new calculator problem? Now we move into the cultural evidence, because this is where you see how the audience and the surrounding ecosystem started building a whole parallel narrative around the same facts. First, there is the December 2024 blow-up itself. People reported that Remy Ma posted alleged private text messages between Papoose and Claressa and accused Claressa of helping put negative stories about her into the press, while Papoose responded that Remy had cheated repeatedly and that he had requested a divorce numerous times. XXL covered the same public blow-up and described it as a social media spat over infidelities, with all parties, including Claressa, jumping into the fight. That event is cultural evidence because it permanently changed how every later interview would be received. After December 2024, nobody was watching Claressa and Papoose as a blank slate couple. They were being watched as the pair at the center of an already disputed sequence. So when Claressa says year 3 later, the public does not hear it inside a vacuum. The public hears it against the memory of leaked texts, IG stories, accusations, counters, and a marriage publicly falling apart in pieces. That is why the clip landed like gasoline. The audience was already primed to believe there was more beneath the surface. Second, you have the way fan culture has been reading every new appearance like a courtroom exhibit. The Shade Room article about the BET Awards is a perfect example. The piece is not even about a statement. It is about a face. A face. That is how deep into interpretive mode the public is now. Commenters were not reacting like casual spectators watching a happy couple at an award show. They were treating Papoose's expression like a clue. One viewer said this was the second video they had seen with him not smiling. Another joked he looked like an usher taking her to her section. Claressa herself jumped in with that "protect your woman at all times" response, which is interesting because it reframes a skeptical public reading as a protective one. That is smart. That is PR aware. But it also proves the point. Even the defenses now have to operate inside the suspicion economy. Nobody can just post a glamorous night and move on. Every moment has to be explained, translated, spun, or rescued. Does that sound like a settled story to you? Or does it sound like a story still fighting for custody of the audience? Third, look at how aggressively breakup rumors and reunion rumors keep surfacing around them. Hot New Hip Hop reported on social media speculation that Papoose and Claressa had split, and Claressa clapped back by posting that she and my man were at his mother's house eating a victory dinner. The article notes that her response still did not quiet critics and that some people interpreted the whole thing as trying too hard to prove a point. Now, to be fair, celebrity couples get breakup rumors all the time. That by itself means nothing. Here is the nuance. The reason it keeps happening here is because the underlying narrative never fully stabilized. If the audience feels like the timeline is airtight and the couple feels organic, the rumors die faster. When the audience feels like it is watching a rollout that might be overproduced, every gap in public visibility becomes suspicious. That is why a dinner at Mama's house turns into a press release. That is why a red carpet walk turns into a body language seminar. That is why year 3 became a headline. The culture is not just watching the relationship. The culture is stress testing the relationship. Fourth, the cultural conversation has already spilled into music and wider hip-hop chatter. Complex reported that Remy Ma released a track called W.I. Fell and appeared to take shots at Papoose and Claressa Shields in the lyrics. Hip Hop DX also highlighted how far the story had spread by covering Lil Wayne joking about Papoose's taste in women amid the Remy Ma vs. Claressa Shields drama. That matters because once a private dispute becomes song material, joke material, podcast material, and meme material, it stops being a relationship story and becomes a culture story. The minute other artists and media personalities start using your situation as a punchline, your control over it is gone. The Clean Timeline crew can go on daytime TV and tell the pretty version all they want, but if the culture has decided there is smoke around the sequence, every new statement gets weighed against the joke, the diss, the leaked text memory, and the viral clip. That is the burden of going public after public mess. You are never just introducing a relationship. You are negotiating with the audience's memory. Now, I do want to acknowledge the counterargument, because if you do not leave room for nuance in a story like this, you start sounding like a blog with a Wi-Fi problem. The counterargument is simple. Maybe Claressa just misspoke. Maybe she was counting appearances, not years. Maybe she blurred one award show with another event. Maybe none of this means anything deeper than celebrity brain fog under bright lights. And listen, that is possible. It genuinely is. But here is why that defense does not solve the problem. The more precise and repeated your public timeline has been, the less charitable the audience is going to be when you suddenly sound imprecise. You do not get to say, our actual year is September 23rd, we met at the Shakur Stevenson fight, we have been together over a year and a half, and then expect everyone to shrug when year 3 slips out on a red carpet. Precision creates standards. Their own interviews created the standard that the public is now using against them. That is not hate. That is consequence. And this is the hard gear shift because the real story is not romance. The real story is media architecture. What you are watching here is the collision between celebrity relationship branding and clip-era accountability. In the old days, a couple could say, "We got together around such and such time," and unless a tabloid had photos, that was basically the end of it. Now, every interview becomes searchable. Every podcast becomes transcriptable. Every red carpet throwaway line becomes evidence. Social platforms preserve all of it, and commentary culture cross-stacks it in real time. That means public figures are no longer just telling stories. They are building databases against themselves. A polished daytime interview, a loose podcast anecdote, a radio soundbite, an Instagram clapback, and a red carpet slip are all sitting on the same digital table. That is why this story feels bigger than gossip. It is a case study in how hard it is to maintain one clean narrative across too many platforms when the narrative itself is serving multiple purposes: romance branding, damage control, image rehab, and audience persuasion. The first systemic angle is what I call the prestige brand problem. Papoose was not just in a marriage. He was in a marriage that functioned as branding. Loyalty was his market value. That meant when the marriage fell apart publicly, the stakes were not just emotional. They were reputational equity. If he becomes the guy who moved on cleanly after being wronged, his brand survives. If he becomes the guy whose timeline looks blurry while the public still remembers the loyal husband legend, then the brand becomes harder to sell. This is why timing matters so much here. A blurry timeline is not merely awkward. It is expensive. It reduces credibility. It invites relitigation of the whole brand story. And once the audience starts revisiting the old mythology with new suspicion, the damage is not limited to one relationship. It reaches back into everything that made the previous image powerful. The second systemic angle is the publicity sequencing of a modern celebrity couple. Think about the pattern. First, the relationship appears inside scandal. Then the couple begins reintroducing itself through controlled formats: radio, podcasts, daytime television, red carpets, polished social posts, future family talk. Complex reported on Claressa talking about wanting a baby with Papoose in 2026, while Hot New Hip Hop noted she was already shutting down breakup rumors and emphasizing how solid they were. That is not random. That is how public relationships move from controversy into normalization. You start with chaos. Then you flood the zone with ordinary couple signals: first date stories, poems, moms, dinners, babies, anniversaries, matching appearances. It is basically narrative laundering. You do not erase the messy beginning. You bury it under a mountain of domesticated imagery. And usually that works, unless the couple itself keeps accidentally reviving the original questions. Year 3 did exactly that. It pulled the story back out of the normalization phase and threw it right back into origin story warfare. The third systemic angle is the social media rumor economy itself. In this economy, ambiguity is monetized. The blogs need ambiguity. The reaction channels need ambiguity. The comment sections live off ambiguity. So once a couple enters the public sphere under disputed timing, the machine has every incentive to keep the uncertainty alive. That does not mean every doubt is fake. It means uncertainty becomes content. A stony face becomes an article. A dinner becomes a counter-headline. A lyric becomes a story. A joke becomes a trend. This is why controlling the timeline is so important and so difficult. If you leave even one crack, the internet will put a spotlight in it. And in this case, the crack was not opened by an enemy, an ex, or a random blogger. It was opened by the couple's own public statements rubbing against each other. One person says mid-2024. Another interview says September 23rd. Another conversation says over a year and a half. Then the red carpet says maybe year 3. The machine does not even need to invent suspense at that point. The suspense is already built in. And there is one more layer here that I think is getting overlooked because everybody is so busy choosing teams. Claressa Shields is not some random plus one in this story. She is a superstar athlete with her own legacy, her own accomplishments, and her own public expectations. BET's own pre-awards coverage framed Aya Wilson as the frontrunner for Sportswoman of the Year, while also recognizing Claressa's undisputed history across 3 weight classes, and after the show BET reported that Wilson won the award. That matters because it shows the split-screen Claressa is operating inside. On one side, all-time athletic greatness. On the other, messy celebrity couple discourse. One lane is legacy. The other lane is algorithm bait. And the longer this timeline conversation keeps chewing up oxygen, the more it threatens to drag the athletic side into a permanent cloud of side story noise. That is not good business for anyone involved. Not Claressa, not Papoose, not the media trying to frame them as aspirational, and not an audience that should be able to talk about a champion without always ending up back in relationship court. So here is the major truth bomb, and I want to say it plainly. Claressa Shields saying year 3 does not prove every allegation Remy Ma ever made. It does not legally establish overlap. It does not solve the private history of that marriage. But what it absolutely does do is blow a hole in the idea that the public relationship timeline is clean, settled, and internally consistent. That part, to me, is no longer really arguable. Because a clean timeline does not need this many adjustments. A clean timeline does not sound one way on radio, another way on daytime TV, and then suddenly flirt with an older number on the red carpet. A clean timeline does not keep forcing the audience to decide which interview version is the real one. And that is why this clip matters so much. Not because it hands us a signed confession, but because it exposes the weakness of the official story. The weak point is no longer an ex making accusations. The weak point is the couple's own public math. And once the weakness comes from inside the official narrative, the whole narrative gets harder to defend. This is the difference between scandal and collapse. Scandal is when outsiders attack your version. Collapse is when your version starts contradicting itself. The Clean Timeline crew has spent months giving the public digestible romance content, how they met, when it became serious, the anniversary, the poems, the first date, the baby plans, the serious love language. That content was supposed to crowd out the ugly origin discourse. Instead, one red carpet moment yanked the whole thing backward. Now everyone is asking whether the launch was different from the beginning, whether the public was given the official version late, and whether the neat September framing was less about truth than about manageability. Again, I am not claiming facts that are not in evidence. I am saying the evidence that is public now makes the official version look shaky. And in a story like this, shaky is catastrophic because shaky is exactly where public sympathy starts to shift. And if you want the harshest version of the truth, here it is. The real loser in this entire clip is not Remy Ma, and it is not even Claressa Shields. It is the idea of a controlled narrative. That is what died on that carpet. Once the audience sees the seams, it cannot unsee them. Once the calculator comes out, the romance stops feeling organic and starts feeling managed. Once the audience feels managed, it gets meaner, more skeptical, more forensic. That is why even innocent moments, a smile, a dinner, a ride to an event, start looking staged to people. Because they are no longer evaluating chemistry. They are evaluating credibility. And credibility, once lost, is harder to restore than affection. Affection can be performed. Credibility has to survive cross-examination. So where does that leave the people at the center of this? It leaves Claressa with a championship legacy that deserves better than endless timeline debates, but it also leaves her carrying the consequences of being one of the people who publicly helped define the timeline in the first place. It leaves Papoose dealing with the fact that the loyal husband mythology that protected him for years is now being audited line by line. And it leaves Remy Ma in a strange position where, even if nobody wants to fully crown her right, the audience is being forced to admit that the official story about what happened and when may not have been nearly as airtight as it was presented. That is the reset. That is the fallout. And that is why the clip is bigger than the clip. It changed the burden of proof. Now the question is no longer, why are people suspicious? The question is, what exactly are people supposed to do with all these mismatched public versions? And this is the part one think gives the audience the emotional landing it came for. The truth is still winning. Not perfectly, not instantly, not in some clean moral movie ending way, but winning. Because the public can be manipulated for a while, not forever. The interviews can be polished. The captions can be cute. The arrivals can be glamorous. The baby talk can soften the edges. But the math does not care about your styling. The math does not care about your PR sequencing. The math does not care how many poems were exchanged. If the timeline sounds different every time the microphones come out, the audience is eventually going to notice. And the audience noticed. That is justice in the internet age, not a courtroom, not a confession, but a crowd catching the inconsistency in real time. Meanwhile, look at the contrast. While the relationship discourse was tying itself into knots, Aya Wilson quietly did what actual winners do and walked away from the 2026 BET Awards with Sportswoman of the Year. One lane was arguing with arithmetic. The other lane was collecting hardware. One lane was fighting body language breakdowns and anniversary questions. The other lane was stacking an all-time resume so strong BET itself wrote that her case closes itself. That is the cleanest contrast in the whole story. One person is trying to stabilize a narrative. Another is just stabilizing a legacy. One side needs everyone to agree on when the story started. The other side does not need a timeline defense at all, because the work is the timeline. And I know some of the clean timeline crew are going to say, you're doing too much over one sentence. No. The one sentence matters because it landed on top of a mountain of previous public details. If there were no prior details, it would be nothing. But there are prior details. There is the Shakur Stevenson meeting story. There is the July 6, 2024 anchor. There is the long texting phase. There is the September 23rd anniversary language. There is the over a year and a half framing. There is the December 2024 leak war. There are the breakup rumor clapbacks. There are the red carpet optics. There is the whole public history file. Year 3 did not create suspicion out of nowhere. It activated suspicion that was already sitting there waiting for one more spark. That is why people care. That is why the clip spread. That is why we are here. So the hero resolution, if we are being honest, is not some fairy tale couple, and it is not a villain getting dragged into the abyss. It is the receipts. It is the audience paying attention. It is the fact that in a culture flooded with spin, people can still hear when the story changes key. That is the line I keep coming back to. One person can sell the romance. Another person can sell the image. But neither can sell 2 + 2 as 5 forever. And once the culture realizes it is being asked to do emotional bookkeeping on numbers that keep moving, the spell breaks. This is only the start, too, and you know why. Because now every future appearance becomes pressure. The next interview matters more. The next red carpet matters more. The next podcast answer about how they met, when it got serious, when it became official, when the anniversary is all of it matters more, because the audience will be listening for consistency now. And beyond that, the Remy Ma side of the story is not done generating content either. Between diss records, social media, and the fact that this whole thing has already lived in public for months, there is no world where one viral BET Awards clip just disappears. It is part of the file now. It is part of the story now. It is part of every future retelling now. So if I am you, I am watching for 2 concrete things next. First, I am watching whether Claressa or Papoose publicly clarifies the year 2 or 3 moment, either directly or by quietly restating the official anniversary and meet story in another interview. Second, I am watching whether the broader media starts tightening its language around the timeline or just keeps repeating the prettiest version because it is cleaner for headlines. That is where the next battle is. Not in a boxing ring. Not in a diss record. In the phrasing. In the sequence. In the tiny details that decide whether the public feels informed or managed. So yeah, if you made it this far, you already know what it is. The clip was small. The implications were not. Claressa Shields may have blown up the timeline in one sentence, not because that sentence proved everything, but because it made the official version sound a lot less official. And once that happens, every old receipt starts breathing again. Drop your thoughts below and tell me where you land. Was it just a slip, or was that the kind of accidental honesty that only shows up when the lights are bright and the script gets left at home for 5 seconds? And if you want the next video, I need to talk about the bigger pattern here, how celebrity couples use podcasts, daytime TV, and red carpets to launder controversy into romance, and why the audience keeps catching the seams anyway. Because that story is not just about Claressa and Papoose. That story is about the whole machine. And, trust me, when we get into how these public love stories are engineered versus how they unravel, the timeline mess you just watched is going to make even more sense.